And uploaded wonderful papers. Thanks for all the work they represent. I know there's always a lot that goes into them. So thank you. I'm Sophie Plagerson. I'll be chairing today together with Alicia, Marianne, and Jeremy. And we have 40 minutes, and this is the first of 2 panels. So you're very welcome to join both panels. They'll be on very similar themes, and I think there'll be definitely some commonalities across the 2. The way we're going to do this is we'll have a 2-minute plug for the 4 presentations from each speaker. And I'd like each person to present 1 key point that relates to the theme, which the theme of today is state, citizens, and social protection in Africa. And so 1 key point and 1 question for discussion. That's what I'd like you to give us in 2 minutes. So we'll start with Getu, then Kate, then Maria and Anna, and Alicia. And then we'll proceed to discussion. We'll try and have discussion that really cuts across the 4 papers, especially given the time constraints, but of course with reference to all 4. So let me hand over to Getu, and you have 2 minutes. Getu, we can't hear you. Please unmute.
Sorry.
Super, thank you.
I was muted. Okay. I'm Getu. I'm a PhD student at Wageningen University, and my presentation today is based on a paper I wrote with my co-authors. So presentation is basically based on how the Ethiopian Productive Safety Net Program, which is the largest social protection program in Sub-Saharan Africa, helped the Ethiopian state to extend its bureaucratic or institutional power to the Somali pastoral periphery by establishing local state structure, which is called the Sub-Kabale. So this program helped the state to extend its power more than before this program introduced. So our major finding, maybe the question what I can present today is, I think we are good, and that may be the area of debate or discussion is, we are good at the implementation of social protection programs in Africa are more effective in extending state power, especially in the purpose and in building state power state structures, more than their own intended objectives, which are poverty reduction. So this may be, I think, our argument or the questions that can initiate discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant question. Thanks, Getu. Over to Kate.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. My name is Kate Pruce from the University of Birmingham, and I'm presenting the paper as it's a work in progress based on empirical material from my PhD project on social cash transfers in Zambia. Some of you have seen an earlier version, and I've aimed to develop particularly around the sort of theory and the framing. So looking forward to hearing comments on the direction it's going and getting some input on that. Really, I'm interested in questions of deservingness, and this paper focuses on the gendered nature of responses that emerged during my fieldwork in terms of recipients of the cash transfer, with a finding emerging that there were very high expectations on women to both work and care, which was not so much the same as men were, particularly in the caring, not really expected to deliver that aspect in the households, and that affected how people were sort of framing whether they deserved sort of assistance from the state. In terms of the framing of the paper, while a rights-based discourse is very prevalent in relation to social protection, often access to state assistance is not necessarily protected by rights in practice, and rather access is subject to attitudes and perception of deservingness that shape targeting criteria in specific contexts. So in terms of the key point in relation to the theme, I'm looking at variations in citizen-state relations, particularly in relation to gender, and drawing on Mohanty's concept of women-state relations. And then I've looked at kind of combining or also bringing in Nancy Fraser's categories of redistribution, recognition, and representation to nuance the analysis and to examine ways in which recognition and inclusion can be shaped by perceptions of deservingness, concluding that social protection can be actually rights determining rather than rights based, which has material consequences for citizens and implications for citizenship.
Super. Do you have a quick question for us?
Oh, sorry. Yes, the question was basically it's around the framing and whether this framing of sort of combining Mohanty and Fraser seems to work, sort of feedback on whether that works, and also whether it sort of adds to existing analysis of gendered relationships between sort of work, care and welfare, because obviously there is work out there that looks at these sort of the gendered nature of these questions, and I really want to make sure that I'm kind of adding and contributing. So it's feedback on the framing really is the key question I have.
Super. Thanks so much, Kate. Great question. Over to Maria and Anna. I don't know which of you wants to present.
Yeah, hi, my name is Maria Clarkus. I hold a PhD in public policy and policy analysis, and I'm particularly inclined towards sociological and anthropological approaches in order to understand change and reproduction. And so our paper today draws on partially on my PhD on the negotiations of Zambia's welfare regime, and partially on the master thesis of my co-author Anne, and on our joint reflections on this. And as the title suggests, our paper focuses on a simple but intriguing research question, namely what is the role of elected politicians in donor-led social protection policy processes. And so in contrast to much of the current scholarship, we are emphasize the power or the additional power of international donors. We are interested in the agency of national politicians and national actors in Zambia. So over to you, Anna, with the key finding.
Thank you, Maria. It's an honor to be allowed to speak here today. In brief, our findings suggest that donors have managed to narrow the participation of MPs in formal high-level policy arenas, as well as shape their foregrounding narratives on social protection, while they did not change the involvement in informal processes. And with informal processes, we mean their intermediary role as intermediate between state and society, and they did not change the underlying values of social justice of the MPs. And our question would be, if from the presentation you had the impression that we were able to line out the actual role and that MPs have, and where their agency is limited, and how you would suggest that we can improve that.
Thanks so much, Maria and Anna. And lastly, Alicia, 2 minutes.
Hi, thanks so much. So the paper we're presenting today is actually with co-author Tyson Juma-Adu, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but it builds on work that was done through the University of Manchester on state infrastructural power and subnational distribution of cash transfers in Kenya. And in particular, we look at Nakuru County and the way in which the state mobilized its state infrastructural power after post-election violence in order to target cash transfers. And we argue that the central state was really able to mobilize the state infrastructural power in order to target down to the really local level, to the village level. So that does have the power when, you know, state is motivated to do so, in particular in certain areas, to ensure that targeting is equitably distributed amongst ethnic groups in areas of violence. But we do argue that, what we see is that limited coverage actually undermines, the citizens' access to programs, and therefore the citizenship impacts of cash transfers. And so I think that's the broader question that I would love to pose to the group. And so one of the linkages that I see is whether limited coverage of programs actually undermines the citizenship impacts that they might have, and in particular, the ability of programs to build these connections between citizens and the state. So we see, I think, in all the programs that were covered by the papers today, that there is a limited coverage. So I would love to pose that as a broader question to the group. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Super. Thanks everyone for keeping to time. I just kind of with a view to directing us towards an overarching discussion, I'll just want to bring 4 potential themes to your attention that I think touch on all of these. But also would love us to pick up on the specific questions that have been asked. I think Alicia's and Getu's are quite close, and the others are specific to the papers around theoretical framing and around sort of findings and how clearly they come through. So 4 themes. One is that citizens and states, actually what we're talking about is a much more complex network of relationships. And so with states, we're talking about just from these 4 papers, I mean, already we can get a lot of the complexity in terms of kind of national versus local and the decentralization of around cash transfers administration. And so in Ethiopia and Kenya, that came up around the dynamics between central and local. The role of MPs as mediators came up in Zambia and Kenya, both as mediators with the national governments, but also in relation to donors. At the citizen level, we have this kind of differentiation around gender. So I think just looking at when we talk about citizens, actually we're not talking about homogeneous groups, and we see that in the way cash transfers interact with state-citizen relations. So we've got this interaction around gender that Kate mentioned in Zambia, around ethnicity in Kenya, and with geography in Ethiopia. So all these different levels kind of add to how we understand state-citizen relations. With all of these, we're looking at how much agency do the different actors have, and is that changing as a result or of social protection. And also external actors, Maria and Anna mentioned the role of external donors. So there's this whole web. So one kind of question that we can have at the back of our minds is, how do we then approach state-citizen relations? Is it helpful? Is it too simplistic? And how do we kind of maximize in terms of using it as a useful concept? That's question number 1. Or kind of just theme number 1 that we may want to come back to. The other is, and I think Getu and Alicia's question really pick up on this, is the interaction between political and civil rights, the realization of them, and on the other, the realization of social rights. Now, as a couple have mentioned, social protection is kind of focused on social rights, perhaps to a greater extent, but now we're looking at these interactions between them, also finding that they're not linear. And in some cases, there's maybe trade-offs between them. So how, ideally, obviously, we want to make progress on all fronts. The reality is different, and there's challenges. How do we prioritize? How do we sequence? What are the lessons that emerge from these case studies that we've looked at? Theme number 3, the framework that Kate mentions, by Nancy Fraser, where we got redistribution, recognition, and representation. The papers kind of speak, I want to pick up on the representation. To what extent are we seeing changes in representation as a result of social protection? So in Ethiopia, the case study was showing, yes, there's a kind of increase in visibility of the state and response from citizens. In Zambia, actually around gender, there was a greater restriction of that space for women. That's kind of simplifying, but that kind of one of the things that's coming through. Around MPs, also a restriction in terms of their space of agency through from international donors, kind of a top-down process, perhaps it restricted participation there. And in Kenya, more of a mix in terms of outcomes. But it was also this other level of reconciliation, I think, adds that Alicia's case study touched on. Yeah, but kind of looking in terms of representation, are we staying within the bounds of a program? is there a difference when there's different programs? So Alicia's study kind of was talking about the pension and others. Are they cumulative when we have different effects, different programs? Are they adding up to greater representation? Those kind of questions. How much is that space expanding in practice? And lastly, a point around the kind of the interaction between clientship relations, kind of patronage politics versus citizenship relations. Again, I think what the case studies are showing us is there's a real, in theory, one passes from, this is often kind of the way it's portrayed, from a clientship, the intention is to move towards citizenship. Actually, and I think the case study from Maria and Anna showed these, actually often you get parallel processes going on and how they mix. So I'd be interested just in your thoughts on kind of the dynamics that we see emerging there, and linked to that, again, what Maria and Anna mentioned around underlying beliefs, that often there's this kind of different layering of beliefs that occur in parallel and don't necessarily meet each other. Sometimes around fairness and deservingness, those play into the kind of underlying beliefs, and Kate's presentation touched on that as well. Deservingness around work and care as criteria. So that's just a few thoughts to get the conversation going, but please do also keep in mind the specific questions for each paper. I'd like to open up for discussion. Please maybe just raise a hand, and just so we can make sure everyone gets a chance to join in. If I don't see anyone, please, as co-facilitators do. Yes, Marianne, go for it. And then Jeremy, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation and the papers and the videos, for those who made those. It was nice to see. And also Sophie for the themes. As for the themes, I want to pick up on the first one around citizens and state. Not so much about the multiplicity of actors, but whether we are maybe too quick to think that now there is an increasing state-citizen relation in several of the papers, because to me it seems that we're setting the bar a bit low. So Alicia as well as Geto, both all papers actually very nice, but it's clear that here we have a state, due to a program, engaging with citizens or interfering with citizens, if we want to be really funny about it. But what about the other way? And I still feel a little bit uncertain about that. Whether we only just seeing that states do something, and therefore, yes, there is an increased interaction by default almost, because you have a program that people are receiving something from. But what does it mean for the citizens? I mean, these Somalis in Ethiopia, and I think it's really a very great case study to have. But what's their position, and what's their position vis-a-vis the clan leaders? As I understand, has it really changed? Do they really see this as such a big difference at all? So I would like us to challenge ourselves around, when do we actually see something that is a relationship and not just a one-directional thing? And then the other thing I had, which kind of maybe relates to the same, is to Kate's paper. I found it a little bit hard to answer about the framework, because in the paper you don't actually unfold it very much. And I know Fraser, but I don't know so much the other one. But again, a little bit around, what do we think is a relationship? It seems to me that from your analysis, I don't see much state. I see more public opinion defining it, and that can also be fine. But then maybe the paper should have a different focus, unless there is something there that you can argue to be state. So that's my 2 comments to start.
Thanks, Marianne. Jeremy. Jeremy, we can't hear you. But you are unmuted, so maybe it's just volume. Mo, are you able to assist?
Hi, I'm here. I'm just trying to see what we can do for Jeremy.
Okay, anyone else like to join in while we just try and get the volume back?
Otherwise, I'll also be keen to hear.
Yeah.
Unless sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to pick up on Anna just said about, and which is I really think is one of the cross-cutting themes, namely social norms or gender norms, but more broadly social norms, which underpin all these different relationships within the state or within different actors at different levels of the state. So I do think this is a very important thing to consider when describing these state-society relations and the complexity within this, because ultimately those ones may or may not be challenged by the policy that is put into place, and it is ultimately those ones that might be reproduced through the relationship and not been challenged, so not seeing a change in that one. So I do think this is something very important, and it can be different types of beliefs. It can also be like shared understandings and shared expectations. It doesn't need to go down to values of social justice, but I think this is something very important if we look into the relations between all these different actors at all these different levels and how they connect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, Jeremy, can you try again? No, I still can't hear you. Are you able to quickly please exit and try and log in again to see if it will work?
Thanks so much. Anyone else? Yes, Alicia.
Yeah, I think these are some really interesting discussions that are going on. And I mean, I just want to follow up, I think, on Marianne's point about, are we setting the bar too low for what we see as citizenship effects? And I think this is a really interesting question when we consider, the interactions between citizens and the state, because I think on one hand, increasing interactions between citizen and state and can have real impacts. But the impacts are going to be so very different depending on the context, right? So what we see as, increasing citizenship in one context may not be the same as another. And I think that's, really evident, particularly in Getu's analysis, where you see that even building any of that relationship with the state and these structures at the local level do have, shifting implications for citizenship, but that in other contexts, even for example, in Kenya, where I see, that it would be very different. And I think we see that even subnationally in Kenya, that what you see as citizenship impacts in one place may not be the same as another, even subnationally. And so I think it does, but it does become this interesting question, because we don't want to set the bar too low. And I think like posing this as saying, what does it mean to really have citizenship impacts? I think you can say that there's increasing interactions between the citizens and the state that have, positive implications or negative implications in potentially. But what does it really mean to have citizenship impacts? And I think I don't have an answer to this. And this is, something that I grapple with in much of my work, but I would love to hear also how other people are thinking about it within their work, and what does this bar actually look like? And I'm not sure that there's a particular bar there, but what do we mean by citizenship impacts, and what does it mean for programs to actually be, I think, transformative? And I think I maybe just wanted to pose another question to get to on this point, because I was really interested in, what the implications were of the competition for power at the Kabele level and sub-Kabele level, for, the administration of the PSNP and the equitable access to resources. So was selection of the recipients for the PSNP actually viewed as fair at the local level? What are the role of local plan leaders within this process? So it's not just this imposition of state power, but the ways in which it intersects with, with local authorities as well. And so I've really found that, there's this focus on the positive aspects of the enhancement of state infrastructural power, particularly for Somali-state relations. But is it really all positive? And particularly in the case of Ethiopia, where, the developmental state has really been this tool to strengthen control over society as well. And I think this can apply in all cases, but in various forms, when we can think about these broader questions, but the implications and the nuances of it, I think are different depending on the political context and the local context.
Brilliant. Jeremy has written a question for all the presenters. And I think it'd be lovely to hear back from the four presenters, kind of in the light of all the other presentations. So the question is, we have 2 country case studies and 2 local case studies. What can the presenters say about the generalizability of their analysis? So if I can hand over to each of you, we'll start with Kate, and it's your hand up. You may want to comment on something else, but to comment on this, and perhaps on Maria's, if you have any thoughts on social norms, and also on Getu's question around how do we kind of balance poverty reduction as a main aim and changing state-citizen relations. And yeah, and the other key point around what do we define as citizenship impacts. Over to Kate.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually had some reflections on some of the things that had come up, some of the themes, which I'll just briefly give, and then I'll answer the question. So I think this aspect of the relationship between citizen and state, and whether it's actually one directional in some cases, is really interesting. And I was thinking about how, often programs are designed and implemented as sort of action is done to citizens, and in what way do they react or have opportunities to respond. And I think some programs build in this sort of accountability. There's sort of a debate about accountability within social protection and how this is a way of engaging citizens more, but often it's more a process. It's not necessarily genuine engagement, if I can put it that way. And sometimes the actual way in which the responses come across, or sort of contestation, might not be in those kind of neat formats that perhaps donors design, or these are the accountability sort of tracks, processes. So in the Zambia case, although I don't focus in on it on this paper, there are ways in which the citizen responses sort of change the design, sort of this sort of bottom-up influence, which suggests that there is a kind of contestation that's coming out, but it's not in a organized way that the implementers necessarily planned or wanted to see, but it was more of a kind of reaction from citizens, which suggests there is a sort of two-way, but are they meeting, and is it a genuine engagement, or how did these dynamics actually play out? So I think that's a really interesting question. And just on the cover, Alicia's question about coverage and how that might affect citizenship kind of impacts, because I think, again, in Zambia, we have seen, particularly because the program sort of scaled up over quite a long period of time, and there were times when it was in some districts, but not necessarily across the whole district, and that had a lot of implications on how people viewed the program and how they perceived their own, whether they were going to benefit from it or not, and their view of the state. So I think definitely coverage, both in terms of design, but also sometimes in terms of practicality of implementation. Maybe there's a aim that it's a national program, but it hasn't actually got to that point yet. And I think that probably does affect citizen kind of perceptions and responses. And just a final point on the kind of rights question and the different types of rights, because I think I've been aware in my paper that I've been talking about sort of rights-based, and I think that as a phrase that in social protection sort of discourse, the sort of rights-based is relatively kind of widely used, but not necessarily specifying what rights and how those are set out. So I think that's another question for myself, and maybe more broadly of thinking about what we mean by rights-based and which types of rights. Just on Jeremy's generalizability question, I suppose in my case study, I wouldn't be claiming beyond the sort of communities that I engaged with, but I suppose the kind of broader questions, if you're talking about these sort of gendered norms, that they might be different in different countries. So it's not necessarily the same findings don't apply, but you can apply, you know, the sort of same theory, but just taking into account that the context is different. So the norms are not necessarily the same, but what's underpinning or kind of understanding that these gendered norms have these effects in itself can be scaled up beyond specific countries, but taking into account those country differences. That would be my response.
Sorry, couldn't find my unmute button. Getu, over to you. Any points that you would like to respond to?
Okay, thank you. I think there are so many questions, so I'll try to respond for some questions. About state-citizen relationships, what about the other way around? Yeah, okay, in my context, pastoralists and clan leaders, they tried to influence the state or the government initially, because initially it was implemented through clan leaders. So clan leaders were able to influence the process how the PCNDP was implemented. But it was gradually, the responsibility was shifted from clan leaders to state actors when the Kabyle and the Sar-Kabyle strengthened through time. So in that context, now it has been totally controlled by state actors, you know, at the Kabyle and the Sar-Kabyle level. So it gradually moved from the one which somehow influenced by clan leaders representing their pastoralists, their fellow pastoralists, but later on it was influenced by the government. The other question is about citizenship impact. Yes, I think maybe we should define what a citizenship impact. I mean, for example, in my context, it is to mean that, you know, the legitimacy of the state has been in program through time, but that doesn't mean that, you know, the rights, for example, the political and the social rights of the pastoralists are protected very well. It doesn't mean that, but I think the legitimacy of the state has been increased through time, because now it is only the government or it is only the states which is providing, you know, these social transfers or these benefits. Because before, the relationship was between clan leaders and pastoralists, so that, you know, social contract was between the two, because the clan is really the provider of safety nets, traditional safety nets. Is shifted from the state is the only interest, but I think that does not mean that.
Getu, unfortunately, the lines are coming and going. Let me get to, we can't hear you at the moment. I'm going to hand over. Sorry, you're back.
Okay. Yeah, maybe because I have internet connection problems, so I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's always tricky at these events when there's lots of people on, but that's great.
So are you hearing me now?
Let me, just because of time, I'm going to hand over to Maria and Anna to close, or no, we should have a couple minutes just to close at the end, but let me hand over to Maria and Anna for a couple minutes for their responses.
Maria, do you want to start?
No, please go ahead.
All right, thank you for all these interesting points. About the generalizability, at least I think for our paper, the general message that it could be interesting to look at the role of MPs in other African countries could be a generalizable takeaway, even though we need to look at the specific political system in these countries, right? But for the findings that we find for Zambia, because we do a method of discourse analysis that is within its setting already, not generalizable, unfortunately. And then, I mean, talking about state-citizen relationships, I'm always struggling. I mean, I'm also very new to the field, just as a white researcher coming from a European context. And I mean, it was the same when we were looking at the literature on MPs' roles. To which extent and degree can we implement, and there we come back to norms and values as well, our thoughts and ideas of political systems onto states that have been influenced in their political systems highly by countries from the global north within history. And if we need to be careful not to perpetuate these dynamics when we keep talking about that like this. Yeah, but in the end, I am not an expert there, so yeah.
Yeah, wonderful point, and it actually hinges to the point of, I mean, how to transform. I mean, what is the legitimacy of externally transforming state-society relations? So starting from the donors and going through the route of government, and to what extent, I mean, as our paper also suggests, is that actually even possible? Or how is it converted, this transformational attempt, actually already at the top and then incrementally trickling down through the mediation of the different actors until it reaches the bottom? So I do think what is very important, what we need to consider is really, I mean, which also our paper draws attention to, but in a more general sense, is the agency of all actors at all levels and their strategic interest within this. And at the same time, also consider how they are constrained by the institutional and ideational context in which they act and in which they live, which shapes what they want and which shapes how they perceive new policies coming in, how they reinterpret things. And I think that is a key factor when we think about trying to change, or let's use the word transform, state-society relations, because it has so many challenges attached because of these different actors. So one point that Getu also makes at the end of his paper is this will not be able to work if we don't work on at the end on empowerment and at the bottom, and really trying to engage in this transformative attempt differently.
Yeah, super. And thanks for bringing, Maria, just comparing those two, and thanks to Anna as well, just for the self-reflection. I think it's really important that that's always a part of the conversation. Jeremy sent a message just coming back to, and I think this is helpful for all of us, just that even when we're not doing comparative research, still do need to consider whether the good reasons for existing studies that shed light on how these cases compare with others. And I think that's helpful, kind of always the zooming out at the end after the in-depth analysis. It's been a helpful discussion. I think with time, we kind of throw in lots of huge concepts and each one could take so much, and as always, I think we leave something like this with more questions, but I think it's helpful just to come back to some of the big themes that we've touched on. How do we define citizenship impacts? What kind of low bar, or what level do we set that bar in terms of kind of actual interaction or between actors? Key questions around social norms and how they shape relationships between actors and their level of agency and constraints within institutional settings. and key questions around the aims of social protection and sort of the poverty reduction as a key aim versus state citizen relations and citizenship impacts, and how do we link those. So I'll draw this to a close. The conversation will continue in 10 minutes in part B of this same panel, and would love to have you join us if you are free. But if not, thank you so much, and especially to the presenters and for making time to make videos and kind of summarize in a very short nugget this here in this session as well. Thanks to everyone, and hope to see you in a few minutes. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Sophie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good.
That's great. Super. See you in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
I assume, Sophie, so are we in this room or a different room?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Mo has left and she said she would see us in a few minutes. So I'm wondering if we need to click on the next link.
Yeah, I think we might need to click out and click in again.
Yeah. All right. But we can stay. Cool. Any thoughts or comments on this before we go to the next one?
For me?
Anything, yeah, or that we can, would you like from us in the next session?
Hopefully not. I've got no idea what's wrong with my microphone, and I got no idea how I fixed it. So that's a bit uncertain.
It's sounding great now, so that's
I'll
good.
see how
I'm
it goes.
sure it will
Okay,
hold.
I do have a few comments, other comments on the first papers, but I'll raise them at the beginning of the second session as well.
Okay.
Anyway, you did well. Thanks for sharing that, Sophie. You
All
did a great
right,
job.
no problem. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Sophie. I really appreciated for connecting themes, and I think that was really useful. So thanks for doing
I'm
that.
sorry it didn't come back. I wanted to give you the last word to.
No, I'm glad you didn't. I think that was absolutely the right thing to do.
Super. See you in a sec.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.